A novice hit the flagstones and spat blood before anyone could catch him. Suspicion drove the occult researcher forward. He snatched the robe and seized the half-burned codex that had fallen from the young man's sleeve. The palm of the novice glowed, where a sigil had burned black lines into skin. The novice minced words through clenched teeth and pointed without meaning to the bells. The central problem was immediate and concrete. The codex recorded names as if accounting for people, and that record threatened the monastery's secret. Within 5 breaths the courtyard filled with monks, and the researcher pushed through them, the book tucked under his arm, intent on one question: who had been signed away? He set the codex on a low bench and peeled back scorched pages. The monastery bells kept tolling for midnight, a blunt rhythm that punctured conversation. The researcher, wearing his scholar's coat and brass spectacles, lifted a magnifying lens and began to read marginal ink scrawls and ledger columns. He felt a shift from suspicion to restrained anger as entries revealed dates, names, and what looked like a tally of spiritual dues. He tapped a fingernail against the paper 3 times, a habit when he wanted to steady himself, who falls at our threshold. Abbot Aurelian demanded, voice short, as he stepped into the courtyard doorway. The researcher did not look up. The codex came from Brother Matthew's robe Miriam, and she held out a hand stained with ink. I saw it when he stumbled past the scriptorium. Miriam's voice carried the exact cadence of a scribe who measured each word as a stroke. Abbot. This ledger lists names with terms like claim and bond, the researcher said. He read a line aloud: Anna, due, 3 seals, ascent postponed, fee rendered. He sounded the words like accusations. The abbot's jaw tightened. His eyes slid to the novice on the ground. Outside, frost crusted the rimstones. The abbot pulled the researcher aside into his chamber. His hands trembled slightly against the wooden frame as he closed the door. You should not carry that book alone, Abbot Aurelian. We have carried weight for generations. We bargained to save bodies. We paid with names are not currency, the researcher interrupted. He pressed the codex on the table between them. Show me the ledger then. If you claim bargains, show me the receipts. He spoke in short sentences, each one a move to force the abbot's face to reveal guilt or fear. Aurelian's hands left damp prints on the cover of the codex. He did not deny the ledger's existence. There is an archive beneath the cellar, he admitted. Not all bargains are recorded in the open page. Some protections require secrecy. We feared what would follow if the wrong eyes saw it. His voice had the worn exhaustion of a man who had made compromises under duress. They descended by a spiral stair that smelled of wet stone and old ink. A candle guttered, revealing shelves bowed under the weight of rolled parchments. The researcher felt doubt flare into a fresher, sharper edge as he watched the abbot slide a flagstone and reveal a hidden chest. The abbot produced a ledger bound in rough leather and handed it over with a small sound. A surrender. In the scriptorium at dawn, the researcher and scribe Miriam worked through marginalia. Miriam spread loose folios on the table. Her fingers moved with the exactness of someone trained to trace letters. She read aloud a notation: Registrar, 1 Archon, juridical seal. Ascents to be taxed at dusk. Miriam's delivery was clinical. The words fell like weights. Read the names to me, the researcher said. He traced a column where small marks indicated sealed decisions. Brother Matthew appears here. September 9th, claim lodged. What does that mean? His question was a blade pulled across the page. Miriam tapped a line with the edge of a stylus. It lists obligations. Vows, devotions, the offering of certain rites, and an item noted as living dues. She paused, eyes narrow. Living dues. The phrase made both of them stop moving. They looked at one another. The scriptorium's light felt too bright, exposing glyphs that had been meant to hide. They began an experimental reading in the hidden chapel that night. The researcher and Miriam lit a single candle and placed the codex on a small stone altar. Each recited the formula slowly, syllable by syllable, hardly louder than breath. The air in the chapel sharpened. The candle flame leaned as if pulled. A shadow folded itself across the far wall, not like a being but like a page of darkness flipping. The researcher braced and reached for the codex by instinct, fingers finding the iron talisman he wore. The shadow moved with the precision of a clerk stamping papers. It made a sound like a small metallic hit, and the smell of cold iron filled their mouths. The manifestation stamped the air with invisible seals, and the researcher felt a legalistic order enclose the chapel like a frame. It counts, Miriam, voice thin. It counts, as if keeping registry. Her hand trembled where she held the stylus. Her fear shifted the atmosphere. That small tremor told the researcher that this was not a demon of hunger, but of administration. After the partial manifestation, the abbot agreed to show the researcher the full ledger in the archival cellar. The cellar smelled of mildew and burnt resin. The ledger's pages were dense, entries written in tight script, and every name had adjacent annotations. Dates, brief notations, and a phrase repeated many times, an old word for registry. The researcher fingered a line where a name matched the novice who had collapsed in the courtyard. The same entry contained a tiny notation reading dues executed. We bargained, Abbot Aurelian, hands folded on his chest. During the famine, the monastery took vows to keep bodies alive. A patron demanded assurances against plague. We offered shelter. In return, we agreed to bind certain ascents. It was meant to be limited. He limited like someone naming a law he now regretted. Who authorized the binding? The researcher asked. His voice sharpened with anger that had not been present at the start. Suspicion had grown heavy and was now edged with accusation. The abbot's face went pale, the council of elders. Brother Damien, I signed once. His eyes avoided the researcher. We thought the Archons would be appeased with rites. We thought we could bargain without cost. His confession landed as a small explosion. Scribe Miriam went silent. The researcher and Miriam planned a controlled experiment to provoke a minimal, confirmatory manifestation and record it. They chose a single formula and a small token from the codex. They read lines aloud in measured voices. The candle flame elongated and threw the arching ribs of the chapel into bright relief. A score of sigils burned like cold coal along the wall, and a figure collected itself into a juridical silhouette. It did not roar. It did not lash out. It arranged the air into the precision of ledgers and stamped invisible seals. It marked him, Miriam whispered. It stamped Brother Matthias' ascension with a dew. It binds the spark she binds while her fingers clutched the stylus. The researcher felt the second emotion shift, from anger to a cold and rising fear. Word of these discoveries reached the refectory by morning. Monks clustered in low voices. Some accused the researcher of blasphemy. Others demanded the abbot explain the bargains. A secret brother, one who usually kept his hood low and hands folded, spoke quietly to the researcher while the chapel windows leaked pale light. I have seen the signs before you were born, the secret brother. I delivered offerings when I was young. The monastery keeps ledgers because outside powers demand payment. We are not innocent victims. We are partners in the ledger. His voice was measured, neither defensive nor cruel. His revelation reframed the monastery from an innocent sanctuary into an institution of exchange. Who is the patron? The researcher asked. The secret brother looked away, a patron calling itself by many names. They write in the margins, to the office of the Archon. They require the registry be precise. Lives are recorded as obligations. The monk Matthew's name appears several times. The final notation shows an invoked claim. His eyes held the researcher with the weight of proof. The researcher confronted the abbot again, pressing for names and specific dates. The abbot produced a sheet of exchanges. Names listed alongside dates when protection had been granted and a column noting the terms. On a line near the bottom lay an entry with a space for the currency, not coins but a term listed as soul service. The abbot's shoulders sagged. We thought we could trade vows and recitations and spare them fever or death. Abbot Aurelian, we thought we were buying time. Then one night a registrar came during a procession. He stopped and swallowed. We heard the counting hum. We recognized the sigils. We signed. His hands moved like someone describing the order in which he had folded his hands to pray. The researcher felt another emotion shift, from fear into grim resolve. He understood that the monastery's rituals were not solely for salvation. They functioned as enforcement. He tightened his jaw and began to plan countermeasures. But before any countermeasure could be enacted, a private ascension attempt by a young brother produced the chapter's violent apex. Brother Matthew had been restless for weeks. He slipped at dawn into a narrow stairwell used by novices practicing solitary contemplations. He recited phrases under his breath and pressed his forehead to the cool stone. The researcher followed on silent feet, clutching the codex and the iron talisman. He watched Brother Matthew begin the ascent ritual, voice barely audible, breath shallow and precise. Chains of ink and light flared from the carved stones. Sigils erupted like black bruises across the stairwell. The air smelled of cold metal and the distant tang of the sea. A tall, faceted shape folded into the stairwell. It moved in non-Euclidean arcs and stopped with the exactness of a judge calling a name. It reached for Brother Matthew's chest, and a thin ribbon of pale light detached and shimmered in the Archon's hand. No, the researcher cried and lunged forward. Iron talisman thrust into the air between the Archon and the novice. He struck at the manifest presence, hands closing on emptiness and cold brass rings that hung and vanished like rusted links. The Archon emitted a layered chorus that vibrated in the researcher's jaw. The Archon did not scream or rage. It pronounced a juridical clause, and the ribbon tightened, as if being bound to a ledger. Brother Matthew's eyes widened. He made a sound like a single syllable of prayer, and then stopped moving. The researcher felt failure in the shape of a physical gag. Brother Matthew's chest went slack. The pale light in his chest braided and then sealed into a small black bead that the Archon clutched and then let fall to the floor. The bead clicked like a coin on stone. The staircase fell into a sudden white noise of monks' shouts. Miriam's voice screamed his name. The secret brother rushed forward and seized Brother Matthew's shoulders. He's gone from our reach. The secret brother, breathless and raw. The registries took him. The researcher dropped to his knees and pressed both hands to the wound where Brother Matthew's soul had been claimed. He felt his fingers burn with a cold that left impressions on skin. He did not swear or raise his voice. He shut his eyes and counted the seconds, measuring the exactness of his failure. Around him, men argued and accused. Some monks blamed the researcher for provoking the entity. Others demanded that the abbot explain the bargains. The abbot retreated, face closed. He would not meet the researcher's eyes. In the refectory that dawn, accusations spun like knives. You forced this on us. One monk spat. You brought a demon into the cloister. Another proclaimed. The researcher answered 2 words and then let the evidence speak. He laid the ledger open on the long table for all to see. Miriam stood beside him. Listen to the dates, she said. We are recorded in transactions. These are not miraculous protections alone. They are contracts. She read passages aloud so the monks could hear the specific qualifications and penalties. Her voice did not tremble the way it had earlier. She read with the steady cadence of someone who had discovered fraud. A cluster of monks formed near the doorway. One pushed forward and demanded to know whether the abbot had consented to soul service. Abbot Aurelian folded his hands and said, I consented when I thought no other choice remained. I am responsible for the safety of flesh. I did not foresee how exact the cost would be. His statement did not placate anger. It only hardened it. Miriam and the secret brother pledged quietly to the researcher that they would not abandon the work. Miriam slipped a small folio into her satchel. The secret brother produced a scrap of parchment with a single symbol on it, an old registration mark used by the monastery's secret scribes. We will help you rid deeper records, the secret brother, but we must be cautious. The ledger watches, his words were spare, practical, instructive. A new realization cut through the monastery's noise. The exchanges were systemic, not isolated. That twist changed how the researcher understood earlier entries. The ledger had not merely recorded ad hoc bargains. It enforced a bureaucracy that monitored spiritual movement. The monastery's rituals had been repurposed into administrative acts to satisfy an agency that kept count. The researcher's mind worked in measured steps. He copied a bureaucratic formula from the codex into his own small book, each letter carefully inked. He pinned his iron talisman to the codex's corner and traced one marginal seal. He felt resolve harden into a directive. He would pursue the Archons' origins beyond the monastery's walls, following the registrations like trail marks. In the final hours before dawn, the monastery's trust splintered. Some monks whispered of exile, others demanded that the abbot make reparations. The researcher did not debate politics. He cleaned his hands of ink, tucked the codex into his satchel, and tested the weight of the ledger by lifting it. In his cell he copied a single bureaucratic formula, the letters small and precise. He pinned the iron talisman to the codex so the book would not be taken without that object at its side. Scribe Miriam knocked lightly and entered. She placed a wrapped packet on his desk. "For when you leave," she said, "a small map to old shrines outside the valley. Names and directions, only 2 places marked." Her voice was tight but determined. "Miriam," she added, and did not expand. The name was the guarantee. The secret brother found the researcher after the first bells of dawn. He pressed a scrap of the abbot's ledger into the researcher's hand and said, "If you leave, you carry our consent to know. We cannot openly act. We will watch and send what we can." His tone was neither pleading nor commanding. It contained the plain weight of those who had seen ledgers and counted tolls. The chapter closed with a single physical act. The researcher pinned the iron talisman to the codex, closed the book, and wrapped it in oiled cloth. He put on his scholar's coat, slung the leather satchel over his shoulder, and stepped into the cold morning corridor. Before he left, he looked back once at the abbot, who remained at the head of the cloister, hands folded, eyes empty with the calculation of guilt. He did not preach. He did not vow revenge. He walked toward the outer gate with the codex secured against his chest. Outside, the sky tilted from black to bruised gray. The final line of the chapter is a precise situational beat. A knocking came from the gatehouse as the watchman announced a traveler seeking shelter, and the researcher paused mid-step to listen, the codex heavy against his ribs. A novice hit the wet flagstones and spat blood as the monk on duty shouted for silence. The occult researcher, hand already on the boy's wrist, felt the skin give under his fingers where black lines had burned in a sigil. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He did not yet know whether the mark was ritual, disease, or both, but he would not let the abbot claim the page without inspection. The abbot barked an order for secrecy. The infirmary door swung closed on whispers and the smell of resin. He moved the boy's head, put fingers to the heat behind the ear, and read the charred letters by the gutter of candlelight. The codex fragment had been half burned. Someone had tried to erase a margin. The researcher unfolded the scrap carefully and traced an angular marginalia that named the Archons as juridical wardens. This names them as law, not parable." The scribe at the table pressed his lips and said, "Father wants no talk of heresy." "Seal it." Suspicion, the emotion that drove him here, pushed him to argue. "Sealing without inquiry will kill the boy or worse," the abbot answered with a clipped silence, and the guards moved closer. Within these first minutes the scene forced the baseline. The monastery had a problem it refused to name, and the researcher had the half-burned codex in his hand. He had been here before. He had grabbed a similar codex in Chapter 1 when a novice fell and a sigil burned black into the skin. That earlier seizure of the Midnight Codex had left him with a thin scar on his left cheek and a codex fragment now in his satchel. He remembered the first blood on the flagstones and the panic on the novices' faces. He did not need to speak his past. He used the half-remembered phrases of marginalia to force the abbot's attention. "You ordered silence last time," he said. "You will not have it again." The abbot's jaw tightened. The tension moved from suspicion toward a sharper alarm. They carried the boy to the infirmary table. The researcher peeled the linen and saw the sigil had black veins branching from the central mark. He pressed a wet cloth to the boy's temple and felt the skin pulse. The surgeon, monks murmured that this was not ordinary infection. The researcher looked at the codex and the marginalia that listed Archons in a ledger, like order, each accompanied by a clause. Jurisdiction, toll, restraint. He the scribe who wrote these codices. The scribe, ink on his fingers, looked away and answered, "Hand unknown." Annotations across generations. That answer shifted the researcher's suspicion toward a new question. If these were legal clauses, who had enforced them? They carried the codex to the scriptorium, where the morning light slanted through a high window, and dust traveled in a slow, visible line. The scribe set the fragment on a reading table, pressed a lens over the ink, and annotated abbreviations. Dialogue opened between them as instruments, and time forced clarity. Scribe read the marginalia aloud. The researcher ordered. The scribe cleared his throat and read, "Archon Hekatios. Juridical ward, regulates ascent by signatures and toll." The researcher, "It reads like a contract." The scribe replied, "Contracts bind those who sign." The shift moved from alarm to a practical dread. These notes were not myth. They were operational language. The researcher tapped the codex with the edge of his finger. His nail left a pale crescent. He thought of the ledger he had glimpsed in the monastery library the previous night, and how the abbot's face had gone cold when he had mentioned offerings to outside protectors. At midday they met in a narrow cloister where sunlight fell in thin bands and two elder brothers stood with folded hands. The abbot had convened a private council and brought in the seer, a woman with a trimmer at the corner of her mouth. The seer warned in a low voice that their planned sealing rite would not free souls but bind them. "Seer, do you claim our rights enslave?" The abbot demanded. "Seer, say it plainly." The abbot. The seer did not raise her eyes. "I say it will ledger a soul to a jurisdiction," she said. "It will write a name in a ledger the Archons can read." The abbot answered, loud now. "We trade safety for ascent. That is our choice." The argument snapped between them in short lines. The researcher watched the exchange, noting the seer's hands, the abbot's trimmer in the jaw, and the elder brother's silence. The scene forced a change in the researcher's emotion. Suspicion bent toward betrayal. After council, the researcher returned to the library and forced open a locked cabinet with a borrowed iron key. He found a ledger bound in tapestry, its edge stained with old wax. The ledger contained entries. Names, dates, offerings, and small columns marked ascents prevented and protections bought. Scribe annotations matched the codex marginalia. He read aloud one entry. "Brother Thomas, ascent prevented, 3 wax seals, payment rendered." He, "Abbot, did you negotiate with outside agents?" He did not ask softly. The scribe and seer, both present, exchanged a look. The seer whispered, "The abbot bargained for the monastery's safety." The abbot's face was white. Guards clustered at the doorway like question marks carved in stone. The researcher felt his anger harden into clarity. Institutional complicity, not superstition alone, sustained the ritual machinery. This new knowledge shifted the researcher's feeling again, from betrayal toward purposeful resolve. In the cloister courtyard that afternoon, he forced the abbot into a public confrontation. Novice lay on a bench nearby under a blanket. 2 guards stood with spears. The researcher held the ledger up where everyone could see the wax seals and the faded signatures. "Abbot," he called, "explain these seals and the names." The abbot's voice was thin. "We chose protection over exposure," he said. The researcher answered, "You traded ascents for security. You sold men a ledgered life." Voices rose. The seer tried to step forward. A guard blocked her. "Seer, stay back," the abbot ordered. The guard seized the seer by the arm and pushed her toward the cloister wall. The researcher lunged. "Let her go!" he shouted. A guard shoved him. His shoulder struck the stone. The courtyard became a place of immediate danger and moral accusation. The argument reached 3 quick exchanges between the researcher and the abbot. "Father, why trade soul for walls?" The researcher, "Because," the abbot answered, "we promised lives to be spared. You promised what you do not own." The researcher retorted, "You promised other masters." The guards moved to seize the novice, who tried to lift his head. He hissed when a guard gripped his arm. The researcher grabbed the guard's wrist and twisted, creating a short burst of physical conflict. The guard snarled, "You will not interfere." And the researcher, "I will see the ledger read." The crowd around them murmured and divided into small, hostile clusters. They decided to perform a sealing rite in the chapel at dusk, part to placate the congregation and part to show the abbot controlled the threat. The chapel's frescoed dome had images of chained angels and mathematical diagrams etched into paint. Monks prepared the implements: iron bands, a chained cosmic compass, small rune discs. The seer watched from an alcove, hands clenched. The researcher examined the instruments and felt the weight of old metal. "If these instruments carry a clause, do not let them be used blindly." The abbot replied, "We will bind, not bargain." The seer stepped forward and said, "If you bind in law, you will ledger more than walls." Argument surged into ritual procedure. As the rite began, orbiting sigils drawn in chalk ignited with an inward flame, and the chained cosmic compass rose from the altar chain. The initial plan collapsed. The compass vibrated and then spun with a low mechanical wear. The Archon manifested as judicial geometry, a faceted plane that refracted the chapel's candles into needle points. The Archon's presence made no noise at first except for a counting hum that the researcher felt in his teeth. The seer cried out and then fell silent. Guards stumbled back. The chapel flipped from a controlled liturgy to a violent interruption. The researcher shouted, "Break the circle!" But his voice seemed to cling to the air. In the moment of manifestation, concrete physical details mounted, orbiting rune, discs rotated and struck the gilded dome with small metallic chirps. The chained compass unclasped and sent a thin filament of light toward the arches. The fresco paint flaked where geometric fissures pulsed. The Archon paused in a judicial stillness and emitted a pale gold shimmer from multiple slit-like eyes. The researcher felt cold ozone at his throat and saw the abbot's hand tremble on an iron band. The seer grabbed for a small iron talisman at her throat. The talisman snapped in two under unseen pressure. The researcher lunged to catch fallen implements and scrambled for codex fragments. The chapter's climax surged through the chapel in raw, physical beats. During the manifestation, the researcher spoke rapidly to command the monks. "Abbot, sound the bell." He shouted, "Scribe, tear the sealed page." The scribe obeyed and ripped a bound folio, scattering ash and ink across the altar. Guards pressed forward, and the novice's face went pale as the sigil on his skin crawled like a map. The Archon extended a panel of faceted shadow and a rusted iron chain looped outward, brushing the researcher's satchel. He felt the leather pull warm and then cool. When he looked, the satchel's stitching had a new pale mark, as though a knife had nicked the edge. A sudden, violent pulse of light shocked the chapel. Someone screamed. Then the Archon withdrew in a non-Euclidean motion and was gone. Silence came that was not quiet. Coughing, the scrape of sandals, the abbot's ragged breath. The seer was missing from where she had stood. A humming trace hung like static in the air. The abbot dropped to his knees and pounded the floor with both fists, a physical breakdown that left his robes askew. The researcher moved among broken instruments and collected codex fragments, stacking ash-stained pages into his satchel. "We cannot say we bound it. We only invited it in." The abbot's eyes were hollow. The scribe said, "The ledger shows more transactions than we thought." The researcher looked at the gap where the seer had stood and found only a smudge of incense and a snapped talisman. Outside the chapel the novice lay still, breathing shallow, and the sigil on his forearm had paled into a set of thin white scars. The guards refused to acknowledge that the Archon had shown itself, and treated the event as a ritual failure they could punish. The researcher argued with them, and with the abbot's men, trading short, sharp lines. "You will not hide this," he said. "We must record what happened." "Record what?" "The abbot that we tried to bind justice, and it answered." The researcher would not let the matter drop. He gathered his satchel, the codex fragments, and the ledger pages he had photographed earlier. He promised the novice he would find a way to read the marginalia and tell the truth. That night, in his cell overlooking the cloister, he inspected his satchel by a single guttering candle. He spread the codex fragments on the table and matched margins until the ink formed a sequence. He laid the ledger entries beside them and saw repeating patterns. Names, seals, and a phrase that read like an accounting of ascents. He felt betrayal again, but now it was focused. Men inside the monastery had signed away their ward's chances to ascend. He whispered aloud. They wrote our freedom into columns. The whisper was an action. He did not let himself drift into abstraction. He paused, fingers hovering over a marginal note that referenced the Archon's chained compass. At the window he touched his left cheek, where the thin vertical scar lived, the scar from the Midnight Codex. He remembered the novice from Chapter 1 hitting the flagstones and spitting blood, and the smell of old risen. The memory returned in concrete detail. The novice's scraped elbow, the codex fragment's burnt edge, the way the researcher had clamped his jaw and taken the page. That earlier extraction had led him here. He pinned a torn margin under a magnifying lens and read a passage aloud. Where ascent is offered, a toll is set. Where a toll is paid, the gate is closed. He did not say more. He placed the codex into the satchel and closed the flap. He slept poorly and woke to a scratching noise beneath the chapel floor. At dawn he checked the ledger again and found a new, small notation in a hand he did not recognize. A single entry with the abbot's seal followed by 3 dots and then a line of coordinates. He nothing aloud. Instead he rose, bound the ledger with twine, and moved toward the chapel. The seer remained missing. The abbot would not admit negotiating with an external order, but the ledger and the eyewitnesses said otherwise. This was the twist. The transaction in the ledger changed the researcher's understanding of the earlier midnight incident. What had seemed like a desperate warning had been a recorded, deliberate trade. The twist forced him to change approach. He would not only expose ritual error, he would expose a negotiated system. He gathered the scribe and the 2 elder brothers who had attended the council. "We will read the ledger aloud to the monastery," he said. "We will show names and seals and demand an explanation." The scribe looked frightened. The elder brother's hand shook. The abbot, summoned, stood at the threshold and said, "You will not turn the brothers against me." The researcher answered, "You already turned them by signing." A brief confrontation erupted. 3 quick back and forth lines. Abbot, "You betray the order." Researcher, "I betray a lie, Abbot. You will bring ruin." The guards shifted their weight. The confrontation made the danger public and forced the abbot's hand. He agreed to a reading, but only under conditions. The sealing ritual would be repeated to prevent further harm. The researcher, "Then the reading must come first." The abbot hesitated and then nodded, his voice a low crack. They convened that evening before the chapter's close. The researcher stood in the nave, ledger open on the lectern, and read names and seals aloud. At each entry murmurs rose. The congregation's faces registered shock and confusion. Some fell to their knees and others hissed at the abbot. The reading was interrupted twice by shouted prayers and once by a woman who demanded mercy for those named. Outside, someone pounded a club against a post. Inside, a novice vomited into a basin. The external events came as required: discovery, reaction, demand. After the reading, the abbot could not deny the evidence entirely. He agreed to remove some seals and to allow a formal inquiry. The researcher felt a cold clarity. The monastery would now be forced to answer for its bargains. Alone again, the researcher emptied his satchel onto the table, aligning the ledger and codex fragments. His fingers trembled slightly. He felt fear tighten his grip, then ease into resolution. He placed a final codex page into a locked drawer and pushed the drawer shut with a key he had stolen from the abbotess' desk earlier that day. The key scraped once and settled. He closed the broken cabinet and slid the ledger beneath his satchel. His fingers trembled when he touched the satchel's leather where, unknown until now, a freshly carved sigil bled into the grain. He watched a thin bead of dark fluid gather at the carved line and felt its coldness against his fingertips. He did not speak. He folded the satchel across his chest and left the cell, moving into the cloister with his resolve turned outward. He left the chapter not with a promise but with an action. He would take the ledger for safekeeping and force the monastery to answer. The last image of the night was precise, his thumb pressed on the damp sigil and a drop of darkness absorbed into the leather. That physical beat completed the chapter's arc and set the next set of choices into motion. A night scribe collapsed with a wet thud before the locked archive table and spat blood across the flagstones. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw. He cuffed the scribe's arm, ripped the half-open codex free with his other hand, and watched fresh ink rearrange itself into a black sigil across the margin. Name yourself. The researcher. The scribe's lips moved without clear sound. Smoke rose from the palm where the sigil had burned through the skin. The problem stood plainly. The monastery's books were not passive records. They were instruments that wrote back. He had come that pre-dawn because of the novice who had collapsed 2 nights before, because of the half-burned codex the novice had spat from his sleeve and the dark lines scorched into skin. That earlier incident had been raw. A boy on the floor, blood between his fingers, a robe torn. The researcher still carried the memory of the novice's eyelids pinched tight while the sigil pulsed like a trapped animal. Those facts guided him now. He set the codex on the table and forced the scribe's hand open. Tell me what happened, the researcher demanded. He dropped the Latin words short, functional, and precise. The scribe tried to name a chapter number, failed, then pointed with a shaking finger at the marginalia. Black ink had shifted into an angular map. The researcher read the numbers aloud and watched the scribe's breath come faster. What is this? Said the scribe, voice small. What did I touch? Night work, the researcher, the ledger. You touched a marginal corrector. He felt his mouth close on the word sigil and swallowed it. For now he used terms the cloister would accept. The scribe's eyes flicked to the doorway where light would come in less than an hour. We will move you to the infirmary, the researcher ordered. He had a list in his head of possible causes. An infection, drunkenness, poison, a manuscript's chemical reaction. Doubt rose next to suspicion, a cold, practical doubt that made him check the codex's binding for recent stitches, the edge for scorch marks. He slid the codex toward himself and flipped the page. The marginal diagrams were not scribbles. They were procedural diagrams, lines that connected named gates to numbered souls. One name stopped him mid-breath. He had seen it listed once before, in the cloister's ledger. A novice, recorded as Aldrin, the same name on the half-burned slip from chapter 1. He closed the book with a flat hand. Aldrin, he said aloud to the scribe. Do you know Aldrin? The scribe swallowed. Aldrin serves the infirmary, so his voice was paper-thin. Suspicion led to urgency. The researcher stepped out of the vault toward the abbot's private chamber, the injured scribe held by the arm. He forced the ledger open on the abbotess' table. The abbot snapped it shut at once. This is dangerous work. The abbot, you would do well to leave it be, brother. We do not need heresy in the cloister. His hand was steady in a way the researcher read as practiced deflection. The ledger records procedures, abbot. Procedures of ascent, lists of names and gates. This is not simple piety. The researcher tapped the page. You keep diagrams that read like laws. Are you enforcing them? The abbot's face tightened. We regulate ritual. Yes, we have responsibility. The archive contains diagrams of procedure, astral law, if you insist on such terms. But your presence is a risk, brother. Leave this subject to the chapter. He set his palm on the closed book and did not look at the scribe. Doubt turned to anger in the researcher's ribs. He flattened his fingers on the ledger and said, "You sealed novices' copies. We sealed what was necessary to preserve the cloister's order." The abbot replied, "You are quick to accuse. This is for the good of souls. Do not make enemies of the chapter." He the last line with a practiced softness that was meant to close the conversation. They exchanged sharp, clipped lines for half a minute, rapid enough that the abbot's hand trembled once. The researcher wanted names, orders, paper trails. The abbot wanted control. 3 short retorts later, the abbot refused to say more. The researcher left with the injured scribe and the ledger half closed under his arm. At the archivist's crowded desk, ink bottles marched like soldiers. The researcher and the archivist hunched over a sequence of marginal diagrams. The archivist, named Brother Merrick, went through the parchment with a steady finger as the researcher read aloud: gate markers, stair counts, registry numbers. A list of named souls recorded beside ascent points. Brother Merrick's voice had a nervous rhythm. Why would Aldrin be listed? The researcher, Aldrin's name appears on the register of newly bound souls. Brother Merrick, look here, this notation. It was added last moon. He pointed at sharper inked numerals. I did not write this. I would have known. He folded his hands into his sleeves. Someone encoded new sigils into the novice's books. The researcher, and the words landed like a small pebble in a pool. He felt the pitch of the room tilt toward alarm. Brother Merrick's fingers hovered over a blot. If someone in the cloister is inserting procedural markings, they do it with permission or with keys we lack. Who had access to bound copies? Footsteps cut across the cloister corridor. A cloister guard, cold and direct, stepped into the room. You want answers? I will speak plainly. He set a sealed packet on the table. I encoded these as ordered. The abbot me to make corrections to the novices' copies. It would keep the children safe from false ascent. I did it myself. His voice was flat. I sealed doors, too. He fixed the researcher with a narrow look. No outsiders. The researcher felt betrayal as a physical pressure behind his sternum. He had expected ignorance. He had not expected active collaboration. You encoded them for the abbot? He asked. Yes, the guard said. He showed me the ledger. He did not bother to deny the ledger's reality. A clear anger rose in the researcher, but he forced it into action. Bring me every page you altered, he said. Bring me the packet you sealed. Show me when you received orders. He pushed for a paper trail. The guard hesitated, then nodded. In the attic above the archive, the researcher worked alone with a fragment of parchment he had torn from the codex. He sat with a lamp. The afternoon sun sliced through a small high window, and his hands moved with methodical patience. He kept his voice low. He read aloud to remember. The fragment reframed what Archons meant. They were not merely monstrous tyrants to be defied. The fragment named them administrators, juridical entities enforcing a system of ascent. The researcher's mouth tasted of metal. New clarity slid into place. If the Archons worked as bureaucrats, then their rules had a logic. He stopped pacing and made a plan. The first emotion shift happened here. Suspicion drove him to urgency. Urgency became anger at collusion, and anger cooled into analytic clarity. He wrote a list. Severing rituals, necessary instruments, potential points of inscription. He crossed out options with a precise hand and packed the remaining papers into his satchel. You will need help, Brother Merrick, when he returned to the attic. 2 monks will stand with you, but they worry. He tapped the ledger with a finger. The researcher looked at him. Bring them at noon. We will attempt a reading. He did not ask for volunteers. He assigned duty. At the cloister chapel, Light pooled on the altar. The researcher and two monks read aloud a hurried passage meant to sever a binding sigil. They followed the printed lines, and the researcher's voice kept the rhythm. The first monk trembled and coughed. The second monk's lips were thin, a page turned, and the chapel geometry responded. The stones shifted with a faint grinding. The Archon answered. A monk's head snapped back, his hands clenched white, his teeth ground. He fell into a convulsive pose on the flagstones and began to chant in a language the researcher did not know. The air had weight. The kneelers scraped. The researcher barked orders, "Hold him! Hold him!" He lunged for the monk and pressed his thumb into the temple, where the sigil flared a dull green beneath the skin. "Stop the chant." Brother Merrick read the next line. Merrick's voice broke, then steadied. Brother Merrick, read. The Archon's presence had physical consequences. Angles bent. A shadow outline across the chapel stretched into impossible proportions. The researcher felt his stomach drop and the rhythm of his heartbeat speed. Fear arrived blunt and sharp. He had already shifted from analysis to active containment, and now from containment to direct defense. The severing failed in part. The monk's convulsion stopped only when someone slid a charred talisman into the chant, and the glowing lines on the monk's palms dulled. The researcher realized the attempt had been insufficient. They had tried to treat an administrative law like a demon and used ritual tools without the proper sequence. The chapter's tone turned from hope to urgency. They retreated to plan their next move. The researcher argued with Brother Merrick and the two monks in a rapid exchange of short, precise lines. "We tried the separation wrong." The researcher, "We lacked a regulating node. Where will you find one?" Asked Brother Merrick. "In the ledger." The researcher, "But the ledger is chained and the abbot guards it." "Then we take it from him," said one monk. "We will not steal." The abbot's voice said suddenly from the corridor. He had followed them. "Abbot, we must open the inner sanctum ledger." The researcher, "Aldrin's name is at stake." "Lives are at stake." The abbot's hands came up in a warding gesture. "You would break order for one name." The abbot, "Brother Merrick, do you back this?" Merrick's mouth opened and shut. The two monks shifted their weight. "I support measured action, Merrick. We should not force the chapter." The abbot's reluctance hardened into a refusal, and then into an order to seal the doors. The researcher felt constriction. Not only was the code juridical, it was enforced by human hands. At dusk they moved into the archive inner sanctum. The abbot led them with a ledger in both hands, its cover charred at the edges. The researcher smelled smoke and iron. The inner vault's layout had been written into the margins. Concentric rules, counterweights of ink and metal. The Archon's manifestation began with a counting hum. The walls no longer met at neat right angles. Angles stretched and split into acute planes. The Archon was not a single monstrous roar. It was a precise, juridical presence that folded space like a book's spine. The Archon manifested above the ledger, a towering faceted plane of umbra, black and bruised gold orbiting sigils, and the slow shimmer of pale gold eyes. Chains of constellations dropped from its limbs and clamped, like cold hands, into the researcher's chest. He felt a tightening around his ribs where one of the chains matched the charred sigil on the monk's palm. The abbot cried, "Stop!" and the ledger thumped like a trapped animal. The researcher made a decision with a single, clean motion. He plunged the codex, one of the binding ledgers, into a brazier already set for ceremonial burning. He had measured the cost. He had put the plan into his satchel knowing the risk. "Burn it!" he shouted. "Burn the regulation!" He thrust the codex into flame. The paper sparked and the black lines blurred. One chain of constellations went slack. A knot came undone. The Archon emitted a counting hum that fractured into a sound like breaking glass. The price was immediate and physical. When the ledger caught and folded into flame, a hot smear transferred to the researcher's palm. He tried to pull away and felt the charred fragment fuse to his skin. He tasted metal and heard a thin, layered chorus in his head as if multiple mouths read names. The abbot fell to his knees and pressed both hands on his face. "No," he whispered. The Archon did not flee. It withdrew a fraction, adjusting its angles like a jurist recalibrating a law. One string of constellation, bound name snapped free. A name dissolved in the air like ash, Aldrin's name, erased from the ledger's margin. The researcher felt relief wash through him, but it was a thin thing. He held the scorched fragment to his palm and felt the geometry burn and anchor into his flesh. The ledger had been a regulation. Destroying it had broken one rule but rung another. The Archon had punished intervention with marking. Dawn came and the cloister showed signs of battle. Singed manuscripts, broken kneelers, and a fresh smell of resin. The abbot sat on the step of the inner sanctum, the ruined ledger in his lap. He did not raise his head as the researcher approached. Brother Merrick stood behind him, blackened at the cuffs but steady. The two monks had already left for the infirmary with the convulsed brother. "You saved a strand." The researcher to the abbot. "Aldrin's name is gone from the ledger." The abbot did not answer for a long breath. When he spoke, his voice was small, precise. "You destroyed a part of our record. There will be consequences from the chapter. We will be questioned. Brotherhood will fracture." He looked at the researcher's palm. "You are marked. The ledger left something with you." A novice drew near on bare feet, eyes down. He did not look at the researcher. He opened his hand. The researcher saw a faint geometric shimmer at the child's fingertip, delicate, like embroidery under skin. The novice's face was the same face that had stood in corridor light the night of Chapter 1. The researcher reached out and touched the novice's wrist. The novice flinched but did not pull away. Brother Merrick stepped forward and placed a steady palm on the damaged ledger. "We have severed one chain," he said. "Another has begun. We must catalogue what burned, what remained. We must track every insertion, every hand that changed a page." The abbot finally pushed himself up and folded the ledger closed with both hands. He did not lock it. He simply set it down as one might set a wounded animal. The researcher looked at the abbot for a long, exact moment and said, "Then we go after the keys. We find who orders the inscriptions and why they chose Aldrin's name." The abbot's eyes slid to the broken ledgers by the brazier. He nodded once, a small, thin motion of acceptance edged with fear. "We will convene the chapter." He did not say whether the chapter would help or hinder. The researcher read the ambiguity as danger. They catalogued the burned margins through the morning, Brother Merrick, the abbot, and the researcher, and collected signatures, not of names but of spatial notations that the Archonist system used. Gate numbers, counter, weights, and registry marks. Each burned fragment they saved in a small lead box. Each fragment carried a residue, a scent like cold iron, a faint numerical hum in the researcher's ear when he held it close. At noon they confronted the cloister guard who had admitted encoding copies. He named the abbot again and produced a sealed packet of corrections. His voice was steady when he said, "I did what I was told. I was told the ledger justified it." He met the researcher's gaze. "If you go after the keys, expect doors to close. Expect men to choose sides." The researcher met the guard's blunt stare with the same resolve. "Then they will reveal themselves by what they value," he said. "And we will watch what they protect." He felt the second emotion shift. From fear back into resolve. He had been marked, he had lost a ledger, and he had liberated a name. The work ahead felt heavier, measured, and precise. Before he left the cloister gateway, the researcher looked back once at the inner sanctum. The abbot remained on his knees before the ruined ledger, the charred pages folded like burnt leaves. Brother Merrick stood to one side with a small box of fragments. The novice slipped a hand into his sleeve and the small geometry in his palm pulsed faintly. The researcher could not tell whether the bloom would grow or fade. He stepped through the cloister gateway into dawn with a scorched fragment fused to his palm and a new, grim resolve to follow the Archons deeper. He carried the ledger's remains and a list of names that should not have been there. He had broken a regulation and gained a mark. The day ahead would demand choices from more than him. Men in the chapter would have to declare who they served. He closed the gate behind him, and in the courtyard a novice opened his hand and a pale geometry began to bloom. The chapter ends with consequence solved and consequence ceded. One chain broken, the researcher marked, and a novice's palm beginning to carry the very sign that had started the chain. This concrete closing leaves a clear new problem: who ordered the insertions, and which men of the cloister will enforce or resist the Archons' juridical order. The abbot remains kneeling over the ruined ledger. Brother Merrick catalogues fragments. The researcher walks away with a scorch on his hand and a plan to find the keys that unlock the Archons' system. Emotion root. Suspicion guided the researcher's early choices and appeared in the first lines. The chapter includes at least 2 emotion shifts: suspicion to anger to clarity, then fear to resolve, expressed through action, dialogue, and pacing. The immediate conflict of the animated manuscript was resolved by burning a ledger at the cost of marking the researcher, and the chapter closes on a concrete event that propels the next chapter. The novice palm begins to bloom with a geometry that mirrors the codex sync. He forced the iron reliquary open, and a living sigil flared across his palm, burning a precise, black pattern into his skin. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw as he staggered back and pressed his hand against the iron rim. The reliquary had been sealed for decades beneath mortar and prayer. Something in the chapter house had kept it hidden. He helped me with the seam, and 3 brothers hauled at the rusted lid while the symbol crawled like ink toward his wrist. Within 5 steps they had blood on the flagstones. The central problem was clear: a codex, a sealed relic, and a mark that named the monastery itself as part of a judicial lattice that bound souls. That single, burning symbol forced the question the researcher had come to answer. How far did the Archons' jurisdiction run within these stone walls? He moved with a measured speed that hid his fear. Suspicion pushed him to act. Every choice came from the need to know who had placed the reliquary and why the sigil had chosen his palm. He wrapped a stained cloth around the mark and carried the reliquary to the chapter house table. The table smelled of grease and old wax. He did not look at the seal for longer than he had to. He placed the reliquary down, set his magnifying lens beside it, and removed the leather satchel that carried the half-burned codex from the previous nights. The room remained full of brothers pretending not to listen. The researcher had a ledger page folded into his satchel from chapter 2. The page had named non-human governors and suggested a network of clerical nodes that maintained these governors' hold. He had not believed the ledger at first. Doubt had been his earliest reaction when the novice first spat blood on the wet flagstones in chapter 1. Doubt turned into caution in chapter 3 when the scribe sync rearranged itself into an accusation. Now, under the chapter house lamps, doubt shifted into alarm. He slid the codex half open toward the head abbot. Brother Elias, the researcher, read this passage aloud. He kept his voice low and steady. The name Elias drew 3 sets of eyes immediately. The abbot tasted his candle wax and unfolded the parchment. The abbot read the ledger line and his face did not change at first. Then a short cough, then his knuckles whitened on the table. This passage names us as a node, the abbot. It states we have kept names here for the counting. His voice was even. It claims we have handed pages to the jurisdiction for levy and for arrest. The word arrest made the novice who had watched in the doorway step back. The researcher put his bandaged hand over the reliquary and felt the skin prickle under the cloth. The refectory smelled of old bread and damp wool. Brothers clustered in candlelight and watched as if the ledger were a pestilence. The head abbot, Elias, had governed with a steady appetite for routine. His decisions had always favored the cloister's survival over risky revelations. The researcher used the abbot's temperament as a lever. Brother Elias, he said, there are names within these margins, names bound to sigils. We cannot pretend this is only superstition." He put the codex page down so every brother could see the cramped ink and the tiny notation that matched the burn on the novice's palm. Elias shut his eyes for a second and then opened them. "The ledger binds us," he said. "We have known of filings of notations recorded and carried. Long ago, the monastery came to a tacit understanding with forces we did not name. We survived because of it." The abbot's voice did not break. A murmur rose. Brother Micah, a broad-shouldered monk who had taken the novice watch the night the boy collapsed, leaned forward. "Elias, Micah, you taught us to hide the ledger. It kept pilgrims safe. Why would the ledger itself imprison a soul?" Micah's voice had a rough edge. His nails tapped the table like a metronome. Elias' jaw worked. "Because the ledger records names under law, Micah. The law here is not for punishment but for order. The Archons respect order." His sentence landed like a small stone. "The Archons respect order." Micah barked. "They take boys by rope and leave nothing but dust." Brothers glanced toward the doorway where the novice still leaned white-faced. The researcher read the room. He needed a covenant of action, not argument. He set the reliquary near the ledger and said, "If the ledger can be used to arrest, then the ledger can be altered to unbind. There is a counter-ritual in these margins. It requires erasure and willing sacrifice." The words drew a sharp intake across the table. Elias stood. His height had always carried command. "You propose erasing names. To erase the ledger is to erase our memory of those names. To erase memory is to risk chaos. Who will answer for the lost souls?" He put his palm flat on the table, as if pressing down the question. The researcher had expected this. "I will answer for my hand," he said. "But we must decide now. If the ledger enforces arrests, delaying is a choice to hand further names to jurisdiction." The room tightened. The head abbot's refusal hardened. "No, we preserve the ledger. We protect the order of the cloister. We will not commit forgetting to save face." His words were measured. He refused the counter-ritual. A small, sharp flash of betrayal passed across the researcher's face. He had come to the cloister to expose mechanisms, not to create war. Emotion shifted again. Suspicion became anger when the abbot invoked survival. He read the brothers' faces. Night scribe Jonas, pale and ink-stiff, looked between the researcher and Elias with the kind of fear that tightened a throat. Jonas had collapsed in chapter 3, while a line crawled in living ink across a page. The researcher remembered the sick, wet sound Jonas had made as he fell. Jonas rose then, slow enough to give time for reaction. "If we do not try, Jonas, they will come again. They will count again at midnight and take another boy." I saw the ink write a name, and then a bell struck and a boy's bed was empty. Jonas's voice was raw. He named no one, but the sentence landed as a small, undeniable fact. The abbot's lips thinned. Brother Micah slammed his hand on the table. "Elias, Micah, we cannot let this ledger act as judge. We swore to shelter. We swore to protect." There followed a quick exchange. Elias repeating that order mattered to the cloister's survival. Micah insisting that duty to flesh outweighed duty to ledger. The researcher let them argue while he slid the reliquary cloth aside to show the burn pattern in the lid, tiny notches that matched his satellite of sigils. Near midnight, a night scribe pushed a half-open codex across the locked archive table, and then collapsed with a wet thud, spitting blood. The researcher reached the scribe and saw fresh ink rearrange itself into a new sentence along the margin. He read the sentence aloud. "This cloister is a judicial lattice. It arrests ascent by filing names into ledgers kept under seal." The scribe's fingers spasmed, and the brothers clustered like a net around a fall. External events repeated the ledger's accusation, turning theory into immediate threat. The researcher acted. He took the codex page and compared it to the reliquary symbol. The codex writes what the ledger enforces. The reliquary binds the sigil to flesh. If we sever that linkage, we break the mechanism. He traced the ink line with his finger and felt the faint sting where the sigil's echo trembled in the air. the brothers whispered. Jonas' hands trembled over his iron stylus. Elias refused loudly. "We are guardians, not arsonists." "We will not destroy what keeps the cloister whole," Micah shot back. "You call it whole while boys vanish at night," Rapid back, and forth followed 5 lines of sharp exchange that exposed motives. Elias argued stability and the cloister's social role. Micah argued compassion and immediate intervention. Jonas pleaded for action. The researcher watched the argument and measured the men. A twist came when Jonas' voice quivering said, "Brother Elias, there is a margin here with your name inked beside a tally." He pushed the codex toward the abbot. Elias' hand hovered and then collapsed over the page. The room went still. Micah swore under his breath. Elias's face drained. He nothing for a long breath. Then he said, "My name records what I signed to keep the cloister operating in famine seasons. I did not know the ledger would be used like a net." Micah's mouth opened. "You signed to protect supplies, Elias, not to bind souls to jurisdiction." Micah's voice broke with accusation. Elias' admission changed the shape of the argument. No longer was this a simple refusal to act for caution. It had become clear that some entries had slipped from administrative accounting into juridical gravities. That revelation changed who could be trusted. Brothers looked at one another with new calculation. The researcher felt the moral rift widen. He had expected refusal. He had not expected the ledger to contain the abbot's own hand. The abbot's past choice now reframed the ledger's role as a tool that had grown beyond its original intent. The researcher decided to act without the abbot's consent. At dawn, the researcher gathered a small group in the cloister courtyard. Night scribe Jonas' brother Micah, and 2 other brothers who owed the cloister their vigilance. The reliquary lay beneath a burned sigil circle. The courtyard still smelled of the winter embers. The researcher positioned the codex between them and began to read the counter, ritual he had deciphered from marginalia. The ritual required precise erasure, specific names scraped and then ritually burned, and an offering of willing memory, someone to volunteer to forget the ledger's filings entirely. The researcher had not planned on sacrifice, but the ledger demanded a cost. "Jonas, the researcher, we will scrape the names and burn the fragments. You will inscribe the burn marks as you go." Jonas nodded and took a trembling breath. "I will do it, Jonas. I will rewrite the lines and burn them as you read." Micah's fingers tightened on the bald scrap of parchment in his pocket. They began. Jonas scraped a name and then set the scrap to flame. The odor of scorched vellum rose. The researcher felt each burnt letter like a hand slipping free. He spoke the ritual lines with a thin steadiness. The courtyard clock struck dawn as the first names turned to ash. The Archon heard the work. The air answered with a low counting hum. The researcher felt the hum measured like a metronome. The Archon responded. The ground did not shift, but the sky above the cloister folded into something that was not sky. Chains of constellations asked and grasped at the novice standing near the circle. The novice cried out, and a chain like a net seized his shoulders. Instruments snapped in the hands of the brothers. The researcher lunged forward to keep Jonas working. He pulled the novice by the sleeve. The Archon's juridical will weighed every move. It froze 2 brothers in place and read names from a ledger no one could see. The researcher saw orbiting sigils flare above the courtyard, slow rotating discs with carved runes. The Archon's voice, layered chorus, said names in a tone that sounded like several men reading different pages of the same book. The researcher could not understand the words, but he felt their meaning as a juridical decree. Some names were claimed. The researcher acted with a physical clarity that replaced earlier suspicion. He unhooked his magnifying lens, jammed the tip of the iron stylus into the novice's binding, and scraped the name from a fragment between his boots. The Archon's hum rose in pitch. Jonas' hands shook but did not stop. He traced another line, burned it, and set it aside. The chain tightened around the novice. "Finish it, Jonas!" the researcher shouted. Jonas worked faster. Ashes pooled in the brazier. The Archon's chains cracked like brittle rope. The researcher forced his sleeve under the chain and tore, feeling the sting in his shoulder where the sigil S shadow bit into skin. He pulled the novice free and slammed the scorched page into the fire. The courtyard filled with the smell of ash and ozone. The Archon's orbiting disc struck the stone with distant metallic hits that made everyone wince. At the height of the struggle, a sudden sound. The clasp of a ledger binding snapping from within the abbotess' quarters. A brother, Brother Micah, had stolen a copy of the ledger and thrown it into the brazier. The researcher saw Micah's mouth set and recognized the shape of decision in it. The abbot's refusal had fractured into active sabotage. The ledger's pages burned. Some names flared up and then faded. The Archon's hum dropped as its source of records dwindled. The Archon roared, not like a creature, but like a court pronouncement. The courtyard shook with non-Euclidean force. The chains coalesced into a throat of narrowing shadow and took one brother, Brother Rafe, who had come to help and had not understood the cost, pulling him up and away in a motion that left a ringing silence. The researcher heard Rafe's boots skid and then silence. He did not have time to mourn. He pulled Jonas back to the brazier and shoved the final scorched fragment into the fire. The Archon withdrew. The orbiting sigils faded and the counting hum fell into a single, distant echo. The courtyard lay littered with scorched parchment and a sigil burned into the researcher's wrist as proof of the bargain. The researcher tasted copper on his tongue and felt a cold shock of grief for Rafe's absence. The abbot sank to his knees and wiped ash from his hands. His face was an engineered calm that barely contained the tremor in his lips. They counted their losses. Jonas wept openly and then stopped when the researcher put a hand on his shoulder. Jonas, the researcher, you did what the ledger demanded. You saved names by burning them. We paid a cost. Jonas swallowed hard. I saw names vanish, brother, he said. They were names I knew. I felt them leave the page like breath. The researcher did not say that he felt their departure as a line gone cold in his chest. He did not speak that he had been tethered to the ledger by a new burn on his wrist. In the aftermath, the head abbot held a council under a dull dawn light. He had once argued for preservation. Now he argued for confession. We must record what we did, he said. We burned pages that were inventory and pages that were more. We have lost Brother Rafe. He closed his eyes. I failed to see that the ledger's reach would exceed our intent. I failed to foresee the juridical extension. His words were specific, not abstract. The researcher watched him and marked the shift. Elias had moved from denial to admission. Emotion shifted again within the cloister. The group's initial suspicion had become a hard, ragged resolve to act at cost. The researcher kept a fragment hidden in his satchel. He had not burned every page. He preserved one small scrap, folded and sealed, under his magnifying lens. He did this because the ledger had taught him something larger. Knowledge could not simply be destroyed. It required custody and scrutiny. He packed the reliquary away into the chapter house niche with a careful tongue, and groove seam patch to deceive a casual search. He kept the sigil under a cloth and hid it beneath the satchel strap. A twist emerged after the ritual. Jonas found a marginal notation that did not match the ledger's hand. It was written in a tiny angular script none of them recognized. Jonas, this is not our ink. It names places beyond our maps. The researcher leaned in and felt an unease he could not name. The abbot read the note and said, "Then this ledger was not only ours. Someone else placed entries here long ago." The researcher realized the ledger might be a ledger of ledgers, a register that other nodes had fed. The ledger was not merely local, it was interconnected. They had saved some names and lost one brother. The cloister's surface order held, but the incident had altered their leadership. Elias offered public repentance and set new watched schedules. Micah volunteered to guard the remaining fragments. Jonas took to sleeping with the codex under his robe. The researcher, however, chose otherwise. He burned most of the codex pages in the scriptorium hearth, but he preserved a single fragment and a sliver of the reliquary's rim. He did this silently, under the cover of dawn shadows, and wrapped the fragment in oilcloth. Before leaving the cloister, the researcher visited the infirmary. He touched Brother Rafe's bed and found only a smear where someone had been taken. He pressed his hand to the wood and said the brother's name aloud. The words hung in the room like an accusation. He did not pray. He arranged Rafe's blanket and lifted a spoon to Rafe's empty bowl. Action occupied him more than speech. He walked the cloister one last time at the transition from dawn to nightfall, the time when the stars aligned as the ledger had once indicated. The sigil burn on his wrist ached with a dull, constant pulse. He kept the preserved fragment under his magnifying lens and told no one which archive he would visit next. He had carried the cloister's burden outward. A final practical decision. The abbot closed the cloister's ledger alcove and declared an internal ledger review committee with Jonas and Micah appointed as custodians. He also swore to present an account to the neighboring priories about the ledger's misses. It was the kind of administrative decision Elias knew how to make. The researcher marked Elias' change as important. Elias had lost the thin cover of plausible deniability and replaced it with public penance. That shift mattered. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The Archons' juridical claim had been reduced by destroying physical records. The cost had been a brother and a sigil burned into flesh. The researcher had chosen to carry forward one fragment, believing that knowledge left unexamined would rot into new jurisdictions. He had also changed the cloister. The abbot's confession and the committee's formation would mean the cloister could no longer act as blind administrative agent. Jonas and Micah now shouldered duties that changed their daily routine and their relationship to power. They did not know the ledger's other connections. Jonas had found the strange marginal notation. The researcher wrote the notation in his own hand and added a cross, reference to a map he would study in the next chapter. He had not yet answered how many other nodes existed, nor whether the Archon's juridical reach could reconstruct the ledger from other sources. Those questions remained, but they were now questions to be answered with work, and with the preserved fragment as a starting point. He closed the book of events with an act. He folded the final scorched ledger page into his satchel, set the single preserved fragment beneath the magnifying lens, and stepped into the dawn along the cloister walk with the sigil still cold against his wrist. The night bell tolled once more as he walked away, and a brother called his name, a cult researcher, asking where he would go. He did not answer beyond a single sentence. Out into the records beyond the priory, he left the cloister gates closed behind him and carried the ledger's burden into a wider world where other nodes might wait.